Get that out of the way first. Since this is a presentation, gotta show the sources, right? There you go. Okay, so this is the presentation on the last temptation of Christ and some of the questions and controversies surrounding the film. So, first thing I'm going to talk about here is the production history and kind of the evolution of the project, I suppose. So, this was, of course, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring people like Willem Dafoe, David Bowie, Harvey Keitel, folks like that. And the film took a couple start stops. So initially it was being put together in, I believe it was 81 was when it was starting out, into 83 or sometime around then. And it was based on a novel originally. That novel received a lot of controversies about, is it blasphemous? Is it the second coming? Stuff like that. So some Christian groups were really against the novel, some were not. So when Martin Scorsese decided to make an adaptation of it, that controversy kind of transferred to him and his production. And there was a sisterhood, an evangelical sisterhood, that organized their followers, if you will, to send 500 letters a day to Paramount, which was the company helping to finance the project initially. During the first go around, Paramount unfortunately caved and they put a stop to the project. It wasn't until a few years later, after Martin Scorsese had made After Hours, that he circled back around to the project and got Universal to help back the project. And part of the contract was that Martin Scorsese would also have to do another film for them, a commercial film, they called it, in order for them to back The Last Temptation of Christ. So that was kind of the hiccups to when it was getting made and whatnot. The film also, because of the start-stop, went through a couple of versions of the cast. So originally, the only members of the original cast before it stopped for a few years and got brought back was Harvey Keitel and the actress that played Mary. Those are the only two same people. Everybody else left the project and didn't want to come back. So Willem Dafoe was from the second version of the cast. He played Jesus and all that, and everybody else was from the second version. Originally, David Bowie's part was going to be played by Sting, interestingly enough. But yeah, so kind of a little interesting casting process there. Apparently, Willem Dafoe was cast after taking a meeting with Martin without having to do a full audition process. Originally, the role was going to go to Robert De Niro because it's a Martin Scorsese film, but apparently Martin, or I should say, Robert said, "I'm not a religious. I'm not a religious guy. I can't do Robert De Niro." Basically, Robert De Niro said, "Hey, I'm not a religious guy. Go look for other people. If you can't find anybody else, then you come back to me." So, in an alternate universe, Robert De Niro played a Jesus, which would have been extra interesting. And apparently, the way Martin, there's a couple conflicting reports about how Martin came to want to make the film in the first place. But one of the reports goes is that it was the actress who played Mary. They were working together on another film. They brought him, or she brought Martin the book and said, "Hey, you really should look into making this a movie, and I'd like to also play Mary while you're at it. But I wanted my fair shot, so put me through the audition process." And that's how some of the casting came together. Uh, so some of the controversy, of course, I mentioned briefly some of the evangelical sisters of some, yeah, uh, a religious group that had that protest, but there were some other protests. For example, um, the firebombing of the Saint Michel's Michael Michel. It's a foreign cinema. It could be pronounced one of many ways. There was a cinema with an underground theater, and there was a local group that decided to firebomb it, and it injured 14 people and sent about 4 of them to the hospital. Now, all the perpetrators were arrested and charged and sentenced to around, because there's multiple, so around a year in prison for the firebombing. And the screen that they firebombed was one that was showing the Last Temptation of Christ. Apparently, also Martin Scorsese, the director, got death threats, and for a little while after the film and during its promotion, he actually had a private bodyguard force to escort him, just in case anybody tried to act on those threats. Um, so, not exactly the most popular film ever, to say the least, and part of it was because it diverts from a lot of interpretations in certain sects to to what Jesus kind of is. Uh, so some of the more evangelical Catholics, for instance, with how divine they view Jesus, and how this film portrayed Jesus more as like a man who ascended rather than a man who was already ascended. That's a key difference. And thus, this version of Jesus in the Last Temptation of Christ was a man susceptible to the follies of man. That wasn't something a lot of evangelical Christians particularly liked. And as a result, that's why they protested the film in this way. Whereas some of the more liberal Christians, basically the ones that were allowed a little bit more interpretation in the stories and the words, praised it as the second coming, as a revelation as to what Jesus is and what he could be. And part of that is because Martin Scorsese himself grew up religious, and even some of the crew that he hired, especially I believe it was the screenwriter, I believe it was a screenwriter that he worked with, that also he went to a religious school with, Martin did, at one point. So there was some of the more liberal religious people that were working on this film, but they didn't share the conservative aspects. So that's how some of the quandaries, I should say, with Jesus' portrayal in this film came to be. And because of the reduced budget that resulted from Paramount backing out and then Universal coming in, this film was made in 57 days. Each take was only 2 to 3 total. And apparently the camera equipment was so bad that they discovered in post that one of the cameras had actually broken, and that's how some of the shots in the film ended up looking that way in the final product, was because it was filmed on that broken camera. And they were like, well, I guess that's just what it looks like now. Print it. So, little fun fact for you there. Also, going off of the controversies again, to this day, Singapore and the Philippines still ban this film, even though this film was made in the 80s. So, 30-something years later, this film was still causing some controversy. Now, those bans are pre-existent from back then, so if they were to reevaluate now, maybe things would be different, but that's neither here nor there. But initially, Turkey, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina also had bans for the film, surprisingly enough. So it wasn't just a simple, deeply conservative or religious based country that banned it. It was also just based on the controversies it was causing. Some countries banned it. A lot of people who were decrying the film hadn't even seen the film and were calling it, unholy abominations, antichrist, etc. Basically, they were stirring up controversy because there was controversy, so they had to get in on the controversy, And that's what led to some of the countries banning these things, was because some of these people were in higher positions of power without actually necessarily watching the film or their country even having a religious stake in the film or the subject matter at large. This caused a mixed response for the critics, the people who actually watched the film, the various cinephiles. Some praised its bold narrative and Scorsese's direction. Unfortunately, most of the people that reviewed the film, that did actually review the film, were reviewing the religious parts of the film, which obviously dominates the film because it's called The Last Temptation of Christ, and the main character, it's Jesus. But a lot of the critics were critiquing the portrayal of Jesus by Martin rather than the actual filmmaking aspects, which did get called out by various critics, such as Roger Ebert in his review later on. So there was a mixed reception. The people that seemed to be reviewing the more religious aspects, again, were pretty split based on which side of the aisle they were on, whereas some seemed to be reviewing it from a more content, just a pure, remove the art from the artist type mentality and reviewing the actual film for being a film. And those who reviewed it in that way actually appears to have liked it a lot, and whatnot. And again, some were kind of, there were some who might have kind of reviewed it negatively from a filmmaking aspect, but just general consensus. Despite the controversies, it did get nominated for some awards, not as many as people as the supporters of the film would say it should have been, but it did get nominated for Oscars. It did earn a Golden Globe for the actress who played Mary, Barbara Hershey. It did earn nomination for the soundtracks, so the score. Um, in terms of the Oscars, it earned a nomination for Best Director for Martin Scorsese. And yeah, so those are the awards that it was nominated for. So some, not all, but there's enough detractors that you knew it wasn't gonna earn or get nominated in every award category possible. In terms of the overall impact on the film industry at large, due to the portrayal of Jesus and how he grappled with some of the more humanistic follies of man, and how big of a film The Last Temptation of Christ became, it was this film that kind of pushed the boundaries on how we portray religious characters in our fictional media, and what we can get away with, what we can't. And it showed other filmmakers what it was that they could do in their films. And that's how you got certain films that dealt with religious figures later on, such as The Passion of the Christ, or I don't know, the other religious movies, and so forth. Passion of Christ is the one that stands out to me immediately, and that's why I got down here in my notes. So yeah, that's how you kind of got to some of those films kind of being made and depicted on screen. By addressing some of the theological themes of the film, or some of the complex theological themes that were present in the film, it kind of humanized Jesus in a way, and some would argue made him more relatable, some being those who supported the film. Others would argue that he shouldn't be relatable because he's Jesus. He's not, he's supposed to be this otherworldly deity that's worshipped. He's not just a normal man. So he shouldn't be depicted. He shouldn't be depicted like a normal man, as some would argue. But either way, it really captured, the film really captured the cinematic qualities of the story of Jesus and how he came to be, and further explored his spirituality and religious identity in ways that we didn't even know possible as an audience, and really helped to, some would argue, really helped to humanize him to the extent that we could see ourselves in his shoes, which again, some would disagree with. And so, yeah, that's what I've got here. About the various production challenges surrounding Last Temptation of Christ, kind of societal reception and impact it might have had, and its role in expanding the cinematic portrayals of religious themes and figures. So yeah, that's pretty much the presentation here on Jesus. Hope you liked it. Give me good reviews. Right. You watching, give me good reviews. That's pretty much all I got. It's not much. That's all I've got written down in my notes here. So, not much more to say. So, yeah, please give me good reviews. Hope you liked the presentation. live on, prosper, all that jazz. Yay.